Like, comment, subscribe, because tonight's story isn't just about a death, it's about doubt, power, and a case so divided it split a nation right down the middle. The snow had already started to fall when they found him. Just before dawn, on a quiet suburban street in Canton, Massachusetts, a Boston police officer lay unresponsive on the frozen lawn outside a friend's home. His name was John O'Keefe, a veteran officer, a trusted colleague, a man who, by all accounts, was supposed to make it home that night. Instead, he was discovered face down in the snow. Red and blue lights flooded Fairview Road as first responders rushed in. The cold was brutal, biting through gloves and boots. Neighbors stood frozen on their porches, watching in disbelief as the scene unfolded. A body, a badge, and questions that would only multiply with time. At the center of it all stood Karen Red. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a shadowy figure fleeing into the night. She was O'Keefe's girlfriend, the woman who had been with him hours earlier, the last known person to see him alive. By the time the sun rose, her name would already be echoing through police radios and whispered conversations. What happened after a late-night gathering among law enforcement friends? Was this a tragic accident, or something far darker? The initial story seemed simple. Investigators suggested O'Keefe had been struck by a vehicle during a heated argument and left in the cold. The focus quickly narrowed. Karen Reed was charged. The narrative took shape fast. Too fast, some would later argue. Because from the very beginning, this case didn't sit right. There were no clear witnesses to the moment O'Keefe went down. No security footage showing the alleged impact. The snow had buried potential evidence, blurring timelines and obscuring footprints. And the house outside which his body was found, filled with law enforcement connections, became a silent presence in the investigation. Inside that house, a party had taken place. Officers, friends, alcohol, laughter, then nothing. No one reported seeing O'Keefe enter. No one reported seeing him leave. And no one, it seemed, heard anything that night. As the investigation pressed forward, cracks began to form. Defense attorneys pointed to inconsistencies in statements, phone data that didn't align, a crime scene that hadn't been secured the way it should have been. Hours passed before certain evidence was collected. Other pieces were never collected at all, and hovering over everything was an uncomfortable truth. The people involved weren't just civilians. They were police, Boston police, state troopers, federal agents, a tight-knit world built on trust, loyalty, and silence. And to the public watching from the outside, it began to feel like that world had closed ranks. Karen Reed maintained her innocence from the start. She didn't deny being there that night. She didn't deny arguing. But she denied killing John O'Keefe. Her defense painted a very different picture. One of a man who never made it into the house alive, or one who did and never came back out the same way. Rumors spread. Online forums exploded. Protesters gathered outside courtrooms holding signs that read, "Free Karen Red," while others demanded justice for a fallen officer. Social media turned the case into a battleground, with amateur investigators dissecting photos, timestamps, and phone logs late into the night. Every new detail seemed to raise more questions than answers. Why were certain calls deleted? Why did timelines keep shifting? Why did the snow seem to erase some clues, but not others? The first trial would end without a verdict that satisfied anyone. Hung jurors, mistrials, and a nation left staring at the same unanswered question. What really happened to John O'Keefe? Now, with a retrial looming, the stakes are higher than ever. Careers, reputations, trust in law enforcement itself. This is no longer just about one night in the snow. It's about whether the truth was lost, buried, or deliberately ignored. And then, just as preparations for the retrial intensified, a previously overlooked detail resurfaced. Something small, something technical, something dismissed early on. A data point that placed a phone somewhere it was never supposed to be. Not on the street, but closer to the house. And when investigators re-examined that detail, the entire timeline threatened to collapse. Because if that data was accurate, then everything they thought they knew was wrong. And the truth wasn't outside in the snow. It was inside that house all along. As the retrial approached, the case didn't just reopen, it unraveled. What had once been framed as a straightforward tragedy now looked like a tangle of missed steps, disputed evidence, and quiet decisions made in the dark. Court filings grew thicker, motions piled up, and behind the legal language, one thing became clear. The story of that night on Fairview Road was no longer singular. It had split into competing realities. At the center of the storm was the timeline. Prosecutors stood by their original theory that John O'Keefe was struck outside, left in the cold, and succumbed to his injuries. But the defense challenged nearly every minute of it. Phone records, they argued, told a different story, one that didn't fit neatly into the state's version of events. Karen Reed's phone data became a focal point. So did O'Keefe's. Experts combed through steps, pings, and timestamps, reconstructing movements down to the second. And the deeper they went, the stranger it looked. There were gaps, unexplained pauses where devices went silent. There were overlaps, moments where phones appeared to move when their owners were supposedly stationary. And there was that one data point investigators had initially brushed aside, now impossible to ignore. A phone signal that placed someone closer to the house than previously acknowledged. Inside the house, not outside. The defense didn't accuse lightly. They suggested something more complex had occurred, something that may have involved people who were never fully scrutinized. People with badges. People who knew procedure well enough to avoid it. Suddenly, the spotlight widened. Questions emerged about how the scene was handled in the early hours. Why wasn't the area treated as a potential homicide from the start? Why were some items collected later, after snow and time had done their work? Why were certain witnesses interviewed casually, while others were questioned aggressively? The answers, when they came at all, were unsatisfying. Human error, the state said. A chaotic scene. Weather conditions. No conspiracy. No cover-up. But to many watching, the mistakes didn't feel random. They felt directional. Public trust began to fracture. Outside the courthouse, crowds grew larger and louder. Some wore blue in solidarity with law enforcement. Others held signs accusing the system of protecting its own. Social media turned every hearing into a live event, every filing into fuel. The case wasn't just being retried in court, it was being retried in the public conscience. Karen Reed became a symbol to supporters, a defendant to critics, and a human being under relentless scrutiny. Every expression, every gesture, every silence was interpreted, dissected, debated. And still, the question remained. If Karen Reed didn't do it, then what happened? Attention turned inward, toward the house on Fairview Road. The gathering, the hours unaccounted for. The people who said they saw nothing, heard nothing, remembered little. The defense pressed harder, seeking records, texts, and internal communications that had never been part of the original trial. Some evidence requests were denied. Others arrived incomplete. And then, unexpectedly, one witness changed their tone. A minor detail at first, a clarification, a correction. But under cross-examination, it opened a door, the kind that had been closed for too long. The witness acknowledged confusion about the timeline, about when people arrived, about when they left. Small shifts. But in a case built on precision, small shifts mattered. The prosecution pushed back, accusing the defense of speculation and distraction. They warned against turning a tragic death into a witch hunt against law enforcement. The jury, they argued, needed facts, not theories. But the facts were no longer clean. Medical testimony became another battleground. Experts debated injury patterns, exposure times, and cause of death. Jurors watched closely, knowing that one explanation meant guilt and another meant reasonable doubt. And looming over everything was the retrial itself, a rare second chance, not just for the defendant, but for the system. Because if the wrong conclusion had been reached the first time, the cost wasn't only personal. It was institutional. Late one evening, just weeks before jury selection, a sealed filing surfaced on the docket. Its contents weren't public, but its existence sent a ripple through both legal teams. Something new, something sensitive, something that could reshape the case once again. No one spoke about it openly, but inside the courthouse, the mood shifted. Because if what was in that filing became evidence, then the case wouldn't just be about Karen Reed anymore. It would be about how far the truth had been allowed to drift and who had benefited from the silence. And as the retrial clock ticked down, one thing became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just a fight over what happened in the snow. It was a fight over whether the full story would ever be allowed into the light. Have you ever heard of a case that just sticks with you? One where the official story just doesn't seem to add up? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most perplexing mysteries in modern history, a story of a verdict that brought anything but closure. This isn't just about a crime. It's about a family's unending search for truth and the lingering questions that haunt a community to this day. It all began on a seemingly ordinary day, but what unfolded would tear a family apart and spark decades of debate. A young life was tragically cut short, and the search for answers led investigators down a rabbit hole of confusing evidence, questionable motives, and witnesses who seemed to have their own hidden agendas. The initial suspect seemed almost too perfect, a convenient fit for a narrative that the public and police were eager to accept. But as the investigation progressed, cracks started to appear in the official story. Let's rewind to the beginning. The victim was a beloved member of the community, known for their kindness and vibrant spirit. Their sudden disappearance sent shockwaves through the town. A massive search effort was launched, with volunteers combing through fields and forests, desperate for any sign. Days turned into weeks, and hope began to fade. Then, the discovery was made, and a missing person case turned into a homicide investigation. The pressure to find the perpetrator was immense. The media frenzy was relentless, and the public demanded justice. It was in this high-pressure environment that investigators zeroed in on their prime suspect. On the surface, the evidence seemed to point directly at them. There were circumstantial links, a potential motive, and a timeline that, with a little stretching, could fit. But for those who looked closer, the case was far from open and shut. Key pieces of evidence were strangely mishandled. For example, a crucial item found near the scene was initially reported as one thing, only to be reclassified later without a clear explanation. Was this a simple mistake, or something more? Then there were the witness statements. One key witness changed their story multiple times, each version slightly different, casting doubt on their reliability. Another witness, who could have provided a solid alibi for the suspect, was dismissed by investigators as irrelevant. These inconsistencies were like loose threads in a tapestry, and the more you pulled, the more the official picture unraveled. The defense team at the trial worked tirelessly to highlight these issues. They presented alternative theories, pointing to other individuals who had both motive and opportunity. They argued that the police had developed tunnel vision, focusing on their client to the exclusion of all other possibilities. They questioned the integrity of the forensic evidence, suggesting potential contamination or misinterpretation. They painted a picture of a rushed investigation desperate for a quick resolution. But the prosecution had a powerful and emotional story to tell. They portrayed the suspect as a cunning and cold-hearted individual, weaving the circumstantial evidence into a compelling narrative of guilt. They appealed to the jury's emotions, emphasizing the brutal nature of the crime and the need to hold someone accountable. In the courtroom, it became a battle of stories. Was it the story of a flawed investigation pointing at an innocent person, or the story of a guilty party trying to escape justice? After weeks of testimony and dramatic courtroom showdowns, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty. For the prosecution and a segment of the public, it was a moment of triumph. Justice had been served. The case was closed. But for the family of the convicted, and for a growing number of skeptics, this was not an end. It was the beginning of a new, agonizing chapter. They believed the wrong person was behind bars, while the real perpetrator remained free. This is where the story truly becomes one of a verdict without closure. The convicted individual has always maintained their innocence, filing appeal after appeal from behind bars. Their family has never stopped fighting, spending their life savings on new lawyers and private investigators, hoping to uncover the one piece of evidence that could overturn the conviction. They've become amateur detectives, poring over old case files, re-interviewing witnesses, and chasing down long-forgotten leads. Over the years, new information has trickled out, further muddying the waters. An anonymous letter sent to a local newspaper years after the trial claimed to have information about the real killer. A deathbed confession from a local criminal, though never substantiated, matched some of the details of the case. Each new development reignites the debate and fuels the hope of those who believe in the suspect's innocence. It keeps the wound open for the victim's family, who are forced to relive their trauma with every headline. What does closure even mean in a situation like this? For some, It's the finality of a court's decision. For others, particularly the families involved, closure is impossible without certainty. The victim's family is caught in a terrible limbo. They have a verdict, but the persistent questions and campaigns to free the convicted person mean they can never truly move on. They are denied the peace that a resolved case is supposed to bring. And the convicted person's family lives with the daily nightmare of believing their loved one is unjustly imprisoned. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our justice system. How often does tunnel vision lead to wrongful convictions? How reliable is circumstantial evidence when a person's life is on the line? And what happens when a verdict, meant to provide resolution, only creates deeper divisions and more unanswered questions? It reminds us that the pursuit of justice is a human endeavor, and therefore, it can be flawed. Evidence can be misinterpreted, witnesses can be unreliable, and pressure can lead to mistakes. The legal system aims for certainty, but sometimes all it can produce is a verdict, a legal conclusion that may or may not align with the absolute truth. The story isn't over. The fight for what each side believes to be the truth continues to this day. New forensic technologies, like advanced DNA testing, offer a glimmer of hope that one day we might get a definitive answer. Perhaps an old piece of evidence, stored away in an evidence locker for decades, holds the key. Until then, the case remains a powerful and tragic example of a verdict without closure, a legal resolution that failed to heal the wounds or answer the questions that still echo through time. What are your thoughts on this? Do you believe a guilty verdict is always synonymous with the truth? Let me know in the comments below. Cases like this are incredibly complex, and it's important we discuss them. Thanks for watching, and if you found this story as compelling as I do, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into fascinating cases. See you next time.